Hello there. It's been a while. Welcome to I was going to call it Hebrew Bible study. I've been studying Exodus so long. I got Hebrew in my mind. Whoops! Well, this cord's coming undone. Welcome to Freeway Bible study. My name is Kurt Bell. I'm your host. I'm a non-believer, yet I like to study the Bible. And it's been a while, and I have Hebrew on the mind because I've finished... Sorry, I have something stuck in my back. There we go. I finished the book of Genesis, which took about 3 months. And before diving into the next chapter, which is the book of Exodus, I decided to devote some time to studying what they call the historicity, I believe, of the topic. You know, is it historically true? Is there a reason to believe that Exodus is a real story, or just a myth? It turned out to be a lot more involved than I thought. I initially, started just casting about in Google for any links I could find, any videos or documentation or whatever that might talk about the story. And then I made a request on Facebook for anyone who wanted to share those links with me. I thought maybe lots of people out there would have their opinions, maybe have done their research themselves, particularly believers who might think one way or the other. And so I collected a nice little catalog of links to go by, and set myself the task then of going through each of those in turn, reviewing them, studying them, and then thinking critically on the topic, and then writing a little summary of that, and then moving on. It took a month to do that whole thing. So that's where I was between Genesis and Exodus, and I finally finished that task. I finished it last week. Today's the 18th day of June, so I finished it last week, and then I gave myself a few days off. So I'm a little out of practice doing this. Today I'm going to recount the first book of Exodus, the first chapter of Exodus. And as I do in this process, I read it and then I try to describe what I just read, so that helps me to remember it and to make sense of it in the larger picture. And let me just point out how interesting it was when I began reading that I spent so much time studying the history, so-called history of the event. And I shouldn't say so-called. I don't mean that in a disparaging tone. I simply mean that there is history in the Bible, for certainly, but a lot of it gives more weight and footing than it deserves, and that's what I mean by the so-called part, right? Because it's the actual history that historians can put their arms around in Exodus is very small and fleeting, but it certainly does reference stuff that is true, but not enough to base the whole story upon. That's not just my own conclusion. That was the conclusion that I read in the opening paragraph when I first started Exodus. My New International Version has a lot of good editorial notes. In the very first paragraph included a sentence basically saying that there's not enough historical evidence in the book of Exodus to provide any validation or grounding that the stories related are true, which is pretty much exactly what my month of research discovered as well. Well, not dismissive of the story outright, historians do not seem to be convinced, at least, dare I say the word, serious academic historians. And I use that word not cautiously. I apply that word, I think I'm being generous to even use the word historian, because there's a lot of documentaries out there that purport to be historical accounts, yet do not use the tried and true processes of history to validate what they're thinking is true. Typically they latch on to one or two bits of evidence and then use that to fill in the wider picture, coloring outside the margins of the lines of evidence that the lines of evidence provide, and then do nothing to either corroborate, extensively, or to attempt to falsify. That's an important part of the historical and scientific method, is an attempt to falsify things, either by showing counterclaims of those who do not believe this evidence, or by attempting themselves to falsify that. Witness, for example, the evidence that was sent to me in several cases, for the crossing of the Red Sea, the evidence, the so-called evidence of chariot wheels in the coral at the bottom of the ocean there, in the Red or Reed Sea, as it was called back then, the Sea of Reeds. And in several documentaries, they simply show these coral outcroppings and cite the configuration of the coral as kind of looking like a wheel or a spoke or a hub of a chariot, and say, there you go. This is though the wood that once made up that wheel is gone, the coral that grew up around it remains in that shape. And this would be very simple to discount by just simply taking a scuba dive, take your scuba tank, and go 5 miles up and down the coast on either side of this area where they think that Moses crossed the Red Sea, and hop in the water out there and see if you can find similar coral. If there are indeed, if just outside of that area, that crossing area, you wouldn't have to go more than a mile outside that area. If you can go out there and you find there is no such coral outcroppings, you only find these wheel, hub, and spoke shape and table, also these table shaped. This would be the hub and the axle and the wheel standing upright. If you only find that right around that crossing area, then that would be interesting. That would say something's different about this area, but they didn't. So that's the type of simple test that attempt to falsify a claim that would lend credence to the claim, and they didn't do that. And nearly all of these, semi-historians, can't find a better way to describe them, pseudo-historians, didn't deploy such standard methods. And this is the reason why they're basically not considered serious academic, their findings, their claims are not considered serious academic, considered serious or taken seriously by the serious academic historical community, who have basically suspended judgment. They basically say there's not enough evidence to basically suggest that an Exodus, a crossing happened, but kind of like a jury in a trial. You don't just swing between guilty and innocent. The way our legal system works out, you swing between guilty, not guilty, not innocent, and innocent. There are actually multiple places that you can rest your claim. We don't call someone, if someone, O.J. Simpson was not found innocent, he was found not guilty, which speaks to the claim of guilt, the evidence towards guilt. It's not saying that he was innocent, but it's simply saying that there's no reason to think that he was actually guilty of that crime. Likewise, historians kind of, for the most part, weigh in on not historically true, not existing, that the Exodus tale did not happen. I can't think of the right word for it. It's not that it didn't happen, it's just that there's not enough evidence to believe that it did. It's not a very convenient way of easily cutting a question into two halves of true or false, but it's a better way to do it. Because it takes into account the evidence on first to one side and the evidence on the other side. Especially what's interesting when you have to consider that it's hard to prove something that isn't. hard to prove God doesn't exist. All you can do is weigh in about, is God guilty of existing or not guilty of existing? That's pretty much the atheist position. It's an important distinction. We're not saying that God doesn't exist. We're just not believing the case. We're not believing the claims that people are making because they're being made on insufficient evidence. Kind of strayed far away from the topic, huh? But that's all right, because I strayed far away from the Bible for a while I was spending all that time researching Exodus. So basically, to summarize that, I did all that work and I wrote a lot, and I produced a lot of information on that, mainly a lot of writing. And that's all on my Freeway Bible Study webpage on my blog, under the Exodus, on the Exodus page itself. So it leads off with the actual effort of research, and then my conclusion, which I just wrote today. My conclusion basically is that I'm agreeing with the biblical scholars who prepared my New International Version Bible, and who in the opening paragraph of the story of Exodus, of their description of it, they basically say that there's not enough evidence to support the historic claims of the book of Exodus. We can't determine if it was actually true. That speaks nothing of the supernatural bits, which no one even attempts to touch that, because of course there's just that's almost I mean, how do you verify the supernatural? Well, for one thing, if it was something you could verify, then it wouldn't be supernatural, right? It would have evidence itself in the natural world. So then you have to reclassify it. It's no longer supernatural. It's a unexplained natural phenomenon. And there's lots of unexplained natural phenomenon, but we don't have good explanation for a pillar of cloud or a pillar of smoke that went ahead of the Israelites and led them through the desert, or the types of plagues that were wrought upon Egypt by God, or the ability to have one's heart hardened by a deity, or heaven forbid, the idea of the parting of the Red Sea and the ability to walk across safely there, or the burning bush, or the commandments on Sinai, or any of that stuff. All this supernatural bits. So you just kind of have to say, yeah, that's an interesting story, and move on. And if you believe it at your own risk, because you're not likely to be taken very seriously by people who care about the truth. It really is the risk, isn't it? I mean, I can't prove that your supernatural claims are wrong, but you won't hold my attention, or the attention of people like me who really do care. And I'm not angry at you, or I'm certainly not angry at a God that I don't think exists, but I want to know it's true. But if you're telling me stuff that can't be shown or proved to be true, then and you maintain that in spite of that fact, then I'm simply going to dismiss your ideas as fanciful, as superstition, as wistful wanting claims made and held on to for an ulterior motive, perhaps an unwillingness to be more serious and rigorous in your examination of the world. And I'll move on and leave you to your suspicions and your superstitions. But don't think that I will leave it at that. You know, when you come to me and try to tell me that I need to think like you, or you attempt to legislate to enact your claims, or you attempt to influence my children or my child in such a way, then I'm going to respond to that. And that's a large part why I'm doing this project as well. Gosh, have I gotten this far in and haven't even started on Exodus? So let's jump into it with a hearty dose of skepticism. The 1 month that I spent studying the story of Exodus leaves me with the conclusion that there's no good history to believe that the story itself is true, let alone the supernatural bits. So I'm going to go into this suspicious that Moses probably never existed. The Hebrew slaves though there may have been some Semite slaves in Egypt, there were never millions upon millions of Hebrew slaves. That a great plague came. 10 plagues came upon Egypt that allowed Pharaoh then to liberate them, to convince Pharaoh to liberate them and send them to wander 40 years in the desert after crossing the Red Sea through a miraculous parting of the waters, and that manna rained from heaven, and the people followed the presence of God in a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. Or that commandments were offered from God unto Moses and brought down from the mountain, and then broken and then remade again in a different form. Different 10 Commandments, 2 versions. No, I'm not gonna believe any of that really happened. This is a myth. This is your myth. No more so than I will believe that though I know there was a place called Troy, and I know there was a Trojan War, I by no means believe that the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey are necessarily true. That there were sea serpents and various monsters and Medusa and the various trials, incredible trials and feats of strength of Odysseus and all those things. Those are mythology, and I don't take them any more seriously than that. I do enjoy them. Likewise, your story of Exodus, unless you can come up with some convincing evidence to show me otherwise. And again, we haven't even touched on the supernatural bits. That's going to require, again, as is often said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Okay, that's a good place to stop and actually talk about Exodus 1. So Exodus 1 takes over where Genesis left off. Joseph is dead. Jacob is dead. Jacob being the progenitor of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob, aka Israel, renamed Israel. He is Israel, and his 12 sons and his 70 individuals sprouting from his loins are alive, or at least they're on their way. So the entire generation of Jacob is gone, and now a new generation of the Israelites, of the 12 tribes, including Joseph himself, who was in Egypt, and the 70 that came down from Egypt. And by the way, there's a bit of a confusion there, right? I mean, we know that 70 from Genesis, we know that there were 70 individuals. This explicitly states there were 70 individuals that came with Joseph from Canaan down into Egypt, into Goshen. This does not include Joseph and his family. Yet in Exodus 1, we hear that there are 70 souls exactly who are the fruit of Jacob's loins. Well, that doesn't add up, because there were 70 that came down, and we know of at least 3 others that were in Egypt: Joseph and his 2 sons, Ephraim and the other one. So that's an error. So if anyone ever asked you, is the Bible in error? Well, there's clearly an error in numbers right there. So that's interesting. But I'm not out. That's kind of, to me, that's not my aim. My aim isn't to nitpick errors here and there, but I will point them out when I see them. So the 12 sons and there's the 70 total have, things in the road, have grown strong, and they've prospered. They have God's favor, and there's many of them now. Well, based on the research that I did, by this time, if we're about, this is going to be we're 1 chapter away from the birth of Moses. So by this point, there must be at least, Moses is going to lead 660,000 Israelite men out of Egypt. That means when you add the women and the children, that must be several million. And we're one book away from the birth of Moses. So that means 1 generation from Moses' maturity. So that means we must be talking about, or at least over 500,000, maybe 400,000 to 500,000. I mean, it depends on how fast they multiply, men and women there. And so that's a lot of people. And so now Pharaoh has become concerned, because he looks at all the numbers of these people, and he should be concerned, right? Because we know from Egyptologists tell us that it's at its height in Egypt, the number of Egyptians during this period, which extends from, which is the Bronze Age, I believe it's also called the New Kingdom Age in Egypt, extends from about 1100 to 1500 BCE. The height of Egypt, there were between 2 and maybe up to 4 million people in Egypt alone. Now the question is, does that include the Hebrew, air quote, slaves or not? If not, then we have 2 to 4 million Egyptians, and we know from the Bible numbers that roughly that same time we have between 2 and 3, maybe up to 4 million Hebrew slaves. That's a threat, right? Imagine if the foreigner, the slaves living in your lands, are almost outnumbering you. And Pharaoh's concern, as stated in the Bible, is that if Egypt were to go to war, that the Hebrews might join with the enemy and liberate themselves from bondage. And then so he says we've got to get these things under control. So he says, let's put taskmasters over the Hebrews, and we'll just work them day and night. We'll work them really hard and make their lives tough and just watch over everything. And that's what they do. But it doesn't work. Then they continue to grow greater in numbers. So now Pharaoh, this is going to be a short chapter. It's a pretty short chapter. Now Pharaoh says, okay, the next thing is that we're going to go ahead and hold on. I think I'm about to miss something. There were three things that Pharaoh did. The first was to put taskmasters over them. The second was to just work them, try to work them to death. I think that was it, or maybe that's part of the first one. I think I'm going to screw this up, so excuse me. It's been a while since I've done this. So he puts taskmasters over them. He tries to work them to death, working day and night. I remember what it was. He put them on some specific projects, and this is where there's actually some history. He actually gives some place names. One of them is Ramesses. The other is his 3-syllable name. Can't remember, something or other. Like an all-he, whatever the heck. And these are actually correspond to real places, and he puts them to work making bricks, which is nasty work apparently. But that doesn't work either. So then he says, okay, well then why don't you? I want you to. He brings together the midwives of the Hebrews, and there's just two women named. And at first I was like, wait a minute, 2 midwives for how many hundreds of thousands of women? And then I realized, well, that's that complaint can be easily answered by simply saying they were the representative midwives, right? They would be the chief midwives, even though it doesn't say this. And that the instructions that Ramesses gives, not Ramesses, that although it may be Ramesses, but it's not. No, this Pharaoh's not named. We don't know who this is. It's speculation that it might be Ramesses. So the Pharaoh says to them, I want you to, if it's a girl baby, she can live. If it's a boy baby, kill him. And I don't think right then it says exactly how to kill him, although we know he's going to say to drown him, and just shortly thereafter. And then they don't do that. The midwives don't do that, largely because they fear God. And when Pharaoh gets mad and brings them back and says, why didn't you do what I said? And the women came up with this great story. They're like, those Hebrew women, they're a lively set of gals, and well, they just have their babies before we can even get to them. And Pharaoh buys that. So then why have Hebrew midwives if the Hebrew babies are popping them out so fast that you don't even need a midwife? Anyway, there you go. So now Pharaoh lays down the law. He says, okay, I want you to take any male baby that's henceforth born in the land of Egypt, and I want you to throw him in the river Nile and drown him. And that's the end of the chapter. Well, if you're familiar with the Bible, you know what's coming next, right? Guess who's going to get born? And guess who's going to be a boy? And guess who's going to get rescued from a watery grave? And that's Exodus 1. Ooh. Wow. I got through it. And here we go. Here's just the start. I think that whereas Genesis had 50 chapters, I think Exodus has only like 30. But they look pretty heavy and pretty weighty. And I think we're going to hit some of the laws in here too. So a lot of laws coming up. That's why, as literature, historians review Exodus as both an epic storytelling, epic legend, and law as well. A book of law. Okay, talk to y'all later. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow for more Freeway Bible Study. Take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye.